Could your love, life, or lack thereof have once dictated your career path into the shadows? Did keeping devastating secrets for empires mean forgoing personal attachments entirely? Was the price of serving a clandestine cause sometimes a vow of solitude? Number 9. The unseen messengers of ancient Persia who rode alone. Imagine a vast empire, the Achaemenid Persian Empire, stretching thousands of miles from the Indus Valley to southeastern Europe, around 500 years before the Common Era. How did the King of Kings, a ruler like Darius the Great or Xerxes, maintain control and communicate across such enormous distances? The answer lay with an elite corps of mounted couriers, the Angarum. Herodotus, the Greek historian, writing around 440 years before the Common Era, famously described their dedication. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. This phrase is now associated with many postal services, but its origin lies with these ancient Persian writers. The system, often credited to Cyrus the Great or refined by Darius I, involved a network of relay stations. These stations were said to be spaced roughly a day's ride apart. At each station, a fresh horse and rider would be ready to take the message onward. This allowed for incredibly rapid communication for the ancient world. A message could reportedly travel from Sardis in western Anatolia to Susa, one of the Persian capitals, a distance of over 1,600 miles, or 2,500 kilometers, in just 7 to 9 days. Ordinary travelers might take 3 months for the same journey. The riders themselves were selected for their endurance, loyalty, and horsemanship. While historical records do not explicitly state only single men need apply, the nature of the job heavily implied it or made it a practical necessity. These were not leisurely rides. They were grueling, high-speed dashes, often through dangerous territory facing bandits, wild animals, and harsh weather. The rider carried royal decrees, intelligence reports, and urgent administrative communications, information that could mean life or death, war or peace. The secrecy and security of these messages were paramount. A rider with a family and local ties could present several libis. Firstly, the sheer time commitment and the constant travel would make a stable family life virtually impossible. They were always on the call, ready to ride at a moment's notice. Secondly, a rider with a family could be a security risk. If captured by enemies or rivals, their family could be threatened to coerce the rider into revealing the contents of the message or to betray the system. A lone individual, without such immediate personal attachments, presented a harder target for such emotional blackmail. Their loyalty was expected to be solely to the king and the mission. The life was one of constant movement, relative isolation between stations, and immense physical strain. The focus required was total. There was little room for the distractions or responsibilities of domestic life. The riders were in essence human data packets, their personal lives secondary to the information they carried. The success of the Persian Empire's administration and military operations depended significantly on the speed and reliability of this communication network, a network built on the stamina and singular focus of these dedicated horsemen. Consider the immense pressure. A single rider, carrying a clay tablet or a scroll, held information that could shift the fate of nations, and their journey was a solitary race against time. Number 8. The solitary sentinels of the frozen poles. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Earth's polar regions, the Arctic and Antarctic, were among the last truly unexplored frontiers. Expeditions to these icy wildernesses were incredibly dangerous, pushing human endurance, technology, and psychology to their absolute limits. These were not just voyages of discovery. They were often nationalistic endeavors, quests for scientific knowledge, and deeply secretive in their planning and execution, especially when rival nations were involved. 4. The men who undertook these perilous journeys, being single, was often a significant, if unstated, advantage, and sometimes a preference for expedition leaders. Think of expeditions like Robert Falcon Scott's Terra Nova expedition to the South Pole from 1910 to 1913, or Roald Amundsen's successful South Pole expedition of 1910 to 1912. Even earlier, the Franklin expedition's tragic search for the Northwest Passage in the 1840s highlighted the extreme risks. These missions involved being isolated for years, facing temperatures that could freeze flesh in seconds, navigating treacherous ice fields and enduring months of perpetual darkness or relentless daylight. The psychological toll was immense. Why would single men be preferred? Firstly, the risk of death was extraordinarily high. Many explorers and their crews never returned, leaving behind a widow and orphan children with a heavy burden on the national conscience, and often on the expedition's finances or sponsoring societies which might feel obligated to provide pensions. A single man, in the stark calculus of risk, represented a simpler loss in societal terms of dependence. Secondly, the men needed to be utterly devoted to the mission and to their comrades. Close quarters, shared hardships, and complete reliance on one another demanded a singular focus. Worries about a wife and children back home could be a profound distraction, potentially impairing judgment in critical situations or eroding morale. Letters from home, if they even arrived, could bring news of illness or hardship that an explorer was powerless to address, adding to their psychological burden. Consider the profile of many of these explorers. Men like Fridtjof Nansen, who crossed Greenland in 1888 and attempted to reach the North Pole in the 1890s, or Ernest Shackleton, famed for his endurance expedition to Antarctica from 1914 to 1916, demanded incredible resilience. While Shackleton himself was married, many of his crew and those on similar ventures were younger, unattached men, drawn by the allure of adventure and the promise of fame. The very nature of the commitment, being away for 2, 3, or even more years, with uncertain prospects of return, was a difficult proposition for a married man of that era. Expedition leaders, when selecting their teams, would look for physical fitness, specific skills, and psychological stability. An unattached man might demonstrate, or be perceived to demonstrate, a greater capacity for unwavering commitment to the expedition's goals. The secretive aspect came not just from the unknown nature of the territories, but also from the competitive national efforts. The routes, scientific findings, and even the composition of the teams were sometimes guarded pieces of information until the expedition's return, if it returned at all. The men chosen were stepping into a void, their personal lives put on hold, often indefinitely. Number 7. When holy orders masked diplomatic secrets. Throughout history, religious orders and figures have occasionally played roles that extended far beyond the spiritual, sometimes venturing into the realms of diplomacy, intelligence gathering, and clandestine communication. While the primary vocation of monks, nuns, or priests was religious devotion, their unique position in society sometimes made them ideal candidates for sensitive tasks where discretion and a certain kind of detachment were paramount. For many of these orders, celibacy was a fundamental requirement, meaning their members were by definition single. Consider the medieval period in Europe. Monasteries were centers of learning, literacy, and often communication. Abbots and high-ranking monks were sometimes literate individuals in largely illiterate societies. They might travel between monasteries of the same order across different kingdoms, or be called upon by secular rulers for their counsel or their writing skills. This movement and access could, inadvertently or deliberately, make them carriers of information. A monk sworn to an order with no direct family loyalties or dynastic ambitions, could be perceived as a more neutral or trustworthy emissary in certain delicate negotiations between feudal lords or kingdoms. Their celibate status meant they were not looking to marry into powerful families or establish their own lineage, which could complicate political landscapes. One can look at specific instances like the role of certain papal legates. These were representatives of the Pope, often cardinals or bishops, sent on diplomatic missions. While not always monks, their commitment to the Church was supposed to supersede national or personal loyalties. Their celibacy reinforced this idea of being dedicated to a higher, non-secular authority. In the complex web of European politics, where marriage alliances were a primary tool of statecraft, a celibate diplomat from the Church could navigate situations where a secular married envoy might be viewed with suspicion regarding their family's potential gains. In other cultures, too, religious figures sometimes undertook sensitive roles. For instance, during periods of conflict or political tension, a monk or a priest might be one of the few individuals able to cross enemy lines under a flag of truce or religious immunity, perhaps to negotiate prisoner exchanges or convey messages. Their perceived neutrality, stemming from their religious calling and detachment from worldly possessions and family ties, was key. The secretive nature of their work wasn't always cloak and dagger espionage in the modern sense, but rather the handling of confidential diplomatic information, peace overtures, or intelligence about the disposition or morale of an opposing side. The internal networks of large religious orders spanning vast territories could also function as conduits for information that secular authorities might not easily access. The vow of celibacy, a core tenet for many, ensured a pool of individuals whose primary allegiance was to their order and its mission, making them in specific historical contexts uniquely suited for tasks requiring trust, discretion, and a life unencumbered by immediate familiar responsibilities. Their monasteries could become repositories of knowledge, including sensitive political or geographical information guarded by individuals whose lives were structured around obedience and a degree of separation from the lay world. Number 6. The one-way ticket pilots of World War II, Japan. During the final desperate stages of the Pacific War, in 1944 and 1945, Japan deployed a terrifying and controversial tactic: the use of kamikaze pilots. These were aviators, officially part of the Special Attack Units, or Tokubetsu Kogakutai, whose mission was to deliberately crash their aircraft laden with explosives into Allied warships. This was a suicide mission, a one-way journey from which there was no planned return. The name kamikaze, meaning divine wind, harked back to a 13th century typhoon that supposedly saved Japan from a Mongol invasion fleet. Pilots were predominantly young, many in their late teens or early 20s. While the Japanese military did not have an explicit rule stating that kamikaze pilots must be single, the demographic reality and the nature of the mission heavily skewed towards unmarried men. The military, and indeed Japanese society at the time, placed immense value on duty, honor, and self-sacrifice for the emperor and the nation. For a young man, especially one not yet burdened with the responsibility of a wife and children, the honor of being selected for such a mission or volunteering for it might have been framed as the ultimate patriotic act. Consider the practical and emotional implications. Sending a married man, a father, on a suicide mission would create widows and orphans, a consequence that, while perhaps unavoidable in total war, was likely a factor in selection. Propaganda portrayed the kamikaze as pure-hearted heroes, embodying the spirit of Bushido, the samurai code of conduct. This image was easier to maintain with young, unattached men. Their letters home, many of which survive, often speak of their love for their families and their country, and their readiness to die for the emperor. They rarely, if ever, mention wives or children they are leaving behind, because most did not have them. The secrecy surrounding the kamikaze units was initially quite tight. The specific training, the indoctrination, and the launch of these missions were guarded. The psychological preparation of these young men was intense. They were often housed separately, celebrated as heroes in waiting, and imbued with a sense of fatalistic purpose. Any lingering personal attachments could be seen as a weakness, a distraction from the unwavering resolve required to fly an explosive-laden plane directly into a heavily defended warship, facing a barrage of anti-aircraft fire. The final letters written by these pilots often included requests to their families, assurances of their patriotic spirit, and sometimes poems about cherry blossoms, symbols of ephemeral beauty, and the samurai's acceptance of death. Approximately 3,800 kamikaze pilots are estimated to have died in these attacks, sinking or damaging hundreds of Allied ships. The recruitment pool often consisted of university students whose studies were curtailed, and fresh Air Force cadets. These were demographics where marriage was less common. The decision to sacrifice these young lives was a desperate measure by a military command facing overwhelming Allied industrial and military superiority. The single status of many of these pilots, while not a formal prerequisite, was an implicit characteristic of the cohort chosen for this ultimate sacrifice, simplifying in a grim way the societal cost of each loss from the perspective of dependence. Their dedication was absolute, their mission terminal, their youth and unattached status a poignant part of their tragic story. Number 5. The unmarried women who cracked Nazi codes at Bletchley Park. During World War II, Bletchley Park, a Victorian mansion in Buckinghamshire, England, became the top-secret home of the United Kingdom's Government Code and Cipher School. It was here that an extraordinary assembly of minds, including mathematicians, linguists, and chess champions, worked tirelessly to break German, Italian, and Japanese codes and ciphers. Most famously, the German Enigma machine and Lorenz cipher. Their work is credited with shortening the war by as much as 2 to 4 years and saving countless lives. What is often less highlighted is that a significant majority of the workforce at Bletchley Park, which numbered around 10,000 people by 1945, were women, and many of these women were young and single. The reasons for this demographic were multifaceted. Firstly, with so many men conscripted into active military service, there was a critical labor shortage. Bright, educated women were a vital and available resource. Secondly, societal norms of the time played a role. For many women in the 1940s, marriage often meant leaving paid employment. Young unmarried women were therefore seen as more likely to commit fully to the demanding round-the-clock work without the perceived distractions or responsibilities of managing a household and family. The work at Bletchley Park was not a standard 9-to-5 job. It involved long, grueling shifts, often under immense pressure, dealing with complex, repetitive tasks like operating the bomb machines designed by Alan Turing and Gordon Welchman, or painstakingly analyzing coded messages. The secrecy was absolute. Staff members were sworn to secrecy under the Official Secrets Act, forbidden to discuss their work even with their closest family members, or indeed with colleagues in different sections of Bletchley Park. This vow of silence often lasted for decades after the war ended. The isolated nature of Bletchley Park, a self-contained community, also lent itself to a workforce that could live on site or nearby in billets, fully immersed in the task at hand. For a young single woman, this environment, while intense, might have been more manageable than for a woman with a husband, perhaps away at war, and young children to care for. Many of the women recruited were graduates from universities, like Cambridge and Oxford, chosen for their intellectual acuity. Others were selected for their perceived diligence and attention to detail for clerical and machine operation roles. Women like Joan Clark, a mathematician who worked closely with Alan Turing in Hut 8 and became deputy head, played crucial roles directly in cryptanalysis. Mavis Laver, later Mavis Beatty, was another notable codebreaker who made significant breakthroughs against Italian naval enigma. These were exceptional individuals, but they represented a larger cohort of thousands of women whose contributions were indispensable. The single status of many of these women facilitated their intense dedication to a job that required unwavering focus and complete discretion. They lived and breathed code-breaking, often forming strong bonds of friendship within their highly compartmentalized sections, a substitute social life for the one curtailed by war and secrecy. The information they uncovered provided vital intelligence for major Allied operations, including the Battle of the Atlantic and the D-Day landings. Their youth and unmarried status, combined with their intellect and patriotism, made them an ideal workforce for one of the most secretive and avil operations of the entire war. They were the hidden heroines, whose silent work changed the course of history. Number 4. The young daredevils of the Pony Express. In an era before telegraph lines stretched across the American West, the Pony Express, operational for a brief but legendary period from April 1860 to October 1861, offered the fastest mail delivery across the vast expanse between St. Joseph, Missouri. This service, covering nearly 2,000 miles or 3,200 kilometers, was a marvel of logistics and human endurance, reducing the time it took for mail to cross the continent from weeks or months to an average of just 10 days. The riders who made this possible were a special breed, and their youth and typically single status were key characteristics. The advertisements for Pony Express riders famously, though perhaps apocryphally, sought: wanted, young, skinny, wiry fellows not over 18, must be expert riders willing to risk death daily, orphans preferred. While the orphans preferred part is debated by historians as possibly an embellishment added later for dramatic effect, the emphasis on youth and a willingness to face extreme danger was very real. The riders were generally young men, some as young as their early teens, though most were probably closer to 18 or 20. William Buffalo Bill Cody, for instance, claimed to have been a rider at age 15. Why this preference for young, unattached individuals? The job was incredibly arduous and perilous. Riders had to cover 75 to 100 miles per shift, changing horses at relay stations spaced 10 to 15 miles apart. They faced blizzards in the mountains, scorching heat in the deserts, the risk of encounters with hostile Native American tribes, though these were less frequent than legend suggests, and attacks from bandits. The physical toll was immense. Younger men were believed to possess the necessary stamina, resilience, and perhaps a degree of recklessness or fearlessness that suited such a hazardous occupation. Being single was a practical advantage. The pay was good for the time, around $100 to $150 a month, but the lifestyle was nomadic and dangerous. Riders had few creature comforts and were constantly on the move. A married man with family responsibilities would find such a life exceptionally difficult to maintain. Moreover, the high risk of injury or death meant that employers, the freighting firm of Russell, Majors, and Waddell, might have subtly favored those without dependents. It was a brutal calculus, but one often present in high-risk frontier jobs. The secrecy involved was not about espionage, but about the precious cargo, mail which could include government dispatches, business contracts, gold dust, and news that could significantly impact markets or personal fortunes. Riders carried a mochila, a special leather saddle cover, with 4 locked pockets for the mail, which was transferred from horse to horse. Each rider took an oath, swearing not to curse, drink alcohol, or fight, and to conduct themselves with honesty and fidelity, protecting the mail with their lives if necessary. Their focus needed to be entirely on speed and the security of their cargo. A young man, without the ties of a family, could dedicate himself more completely to the demanding schedule and the ever-present dangers of the trail. Pony Express, though short-lived due to the advent of the transcontinental telegraph, became an enduring symbol of American frontier spirit, largely thanks to the image of these brave, solitary young riders racing against time and the elements. Number 3. The palace eunuchs, guarding imperial secrets and harems. For thousands of years, in civilizations ranging from ancient China and Persia to the Byzantine and Ottoman empires, eunuchs played unique and often powerful roles within royal courts. A eunuch is a man who has been castrated. This drastic, irreversible alteration was often a prerequisite for certain sensitive positions, particularly those involving close proximity to the ruler, royal finances, state secrets, and, most notably, the imperial harem. Their enforced single status, in the most fundamental biological sense, was the very foundation of their employment in these specific capacities. In imperial China, for example, eunuchs served emperors for over 2 millennia, from the Han dynasty around 200 years before the Common Era, right up to the fall of the Etimad dynasty in 1912. Their numbers could be vast. At times, tens of thousands of eunuchs worked within the Forbidden City in Beijing. Their roles were diverse, ranging from domestic servants and record keepers to high-ranking advisors, military commanders, and even de facto rulers during periods of weak imperial leadership. The rationale for employing eunuchs in such intimate and powerful positions was multifaceted. Crucially, because they could not produce heirs, they were seen as less of a dynastic threat. They could not establish their own rival family line to usurp the throne. Their loyalty, theoretically, was solely to the emperor or the imperial family they served. Their access to the imperial harem was a key reason for their castration. The harem, consisting of the emperor's wives, concubines, and female relatives, was a strictly guarded private space. Allowing intact men near these women would risk unauthorized liaisons and confusion over the paternity of imperial offspring, which could lead to succession crises and political instability. Eunuchs were considered safe guardians and administrators of these inner sanctums. They managed the daily lives of the harem women, controlled access, and sometimes wielded considerable influence through their relationships with powerful empresses or concubines. Similarly, in the Ottoman Empire, eunuchs, particularly chief black eunuchs, Kislar Agassi, held immense power. They controlled the imperial harem, managed the extensive properties and endowments that supported it, and often had the ear of the sultan. They were privy to the most intimate court secrets, political intrigues, and succession plots. Their inability to father children ensured they remained separate from the intricate web of marriage alliances that defined much of Ottoman court politics among the viziers and pashas. The job of a palace eunuch was inherently secretive. They were gatekeepers of information, observers of private imperial life, and often conduits for sensitive communications. Their loyalty was bought at a high personal price, the loss of their manhood and the ability to have a family. This made them, in the eyes of their employers, uniquely suited for roles that demanded absolute discretion and a detachment from the normal ambitions associated with family and lineage. While some eunuchs amassed great personal wealth and power, their position was always dependent on imperial favor, and their legacy could not be passed on through children. Their existence was a stark example of how a specific physical state, ensuring singlehood and childlessness, became a fundamental requirement for jobs at the very heart of imperial power and secrecy. Number 2. The sacred celibacy of Rome's Vestal Virgins. In ancient Rome, for over 1,000 years, from roughly the 7th century before the Common Era until the late 4th century Common Era, a small group of priestesses known as the Vestal Virgins held one of the most honored and simultaneously restrictive positions in Roman society. Their primary duty was the perpetual maintenance of the sacred fire of Vesta, the goddess of the hearth, home, and family, in her temple in the Roman Forum. If this fire went out, it was considered a dire omen, signifying that the goddess had withdrawn her protection from Rome. The Vestals also guarded other sacred objects, the nature of which was so secret that only they and the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest, knew what they were. Being a Vestal Virgin was not just a job. It was a sacred calling, and an absolute prerequisite was virginity and, by extension, a vow of celibacy for the duration of their service. Girls were chosen to become Vestals between the ages of 6 and 10. They were selected by the Pontifex Maximus and had to be free from physical and mental defects and born of freeborn Roman parents. They served for a minimum of 30 years, 10 years as a novice learning their duties, 10 years performing the rituals, and 10 years teaching new novices. After 30 years of service, a Vestal was free to leave the priesthood and marry, however few chose to do so. Perhaps due to the immense status and independence they enjoyed as Vestals, or because marrying late in life after such a unique upbringing was considered somewhat inauspicious or difficult. The vow of chastity was paramount. A Vestal virgin who broke her vow and engaged in sexual relations was considered to have committed a grave act of pollution, incestum, that endangered the entire Roman state. Punishment was terrifyingly severe. She would be ritually buried alive in an underground chamber in a place called the Campus Sceleratus, the evil field. Her male partner in the act would be flogged to death in public. The sanctity of the Vestals was directly linked to the safety and prosperity of Rome. Their purity was symbolic of the city's own integrity. Why was singlehood, in the form of virginity and celibacy, so crucial? The sacred fire of Vesta was a symbol of Rome's continuity and domestic security. Virgins were seen as pure, uncorrupted conduits for divine favor. Their ritual purity was believed to ensure the efficacy of the rites they performed. A Vestal's body was sacred and inviolable. They enjoyed privileges unique among Roman women. They were not under the legal authority of their fathers or a husband, sui juris. They could own property, make a will, and give evidence in court. They had seats of honor at public games and ceremonies. Anyone who injured a Vestal faced the death penalty. Their secretive duties extended beyond just the fire. They officiated at certain public religious ceremonies, prepared ritual substances like mola salsa, a salted flour mixture used in sacrifices, and were custodians of important state documents, treaties, and the wills of prominent citizens, including emperors. Their temple was a repository of trust. This immense responsibility and sacred status was entirely dependent on their adherence to their vow of celibacy. The role of the Vestal virgins demonstrates how, in a deeply religious society, a state of ritual purity, defined by being unmarried and chaste, was an absolute prerequisite for a job that combined profound religious significance with the guardianship of state secrets and symbols. There were usually only 6 Vestals at any given time, making them an incredibly select and highly scrutinized group whose personal lives were a matter of public and divine concern. Number 1. When being unattached was an asset for World War II Special Operations Executive agents. The Special Operations Executive, or SO, was a secret British organization formed in July 1940 with the direct order from Winston Churchill to set Europe ablaze. Mission was to conduct espionage, sabotage, and reconnaissance in occupied Europe and later in Southeast Asia, and to aid local resistance movements against Axis powers. SO agents, both men and women, were parachuted behind enemy lines, often operating alone or in very small teams, under constant threat of capture, torture, and execution by the Gestapo or other enemy security forces. For these incredibly hazardous roles, being single or unattached was frequently considered a significant advantage, though not always an explicit written rule. The reasons were starkly practical and deeply psychological. Firstly, an agent with a spouse and children back home had more emotional vulnerabilities. The fear for their family's safety or the longing for them could be a distraction or a source of immense psychological pressure in an already overwhelmingly stressful environment. Conversely, the enemy could potentially use an agent's family as leverage if their identity or connections were discovered. A single individual, or someone widowed, presented fewer such targets for emotional coercion. For example, notable female, so agents like Violette Chabot and Nur Inayat Khan, were a widow and a single woman respectively. While their motivations were complex and deeply personal, their unattached status arguably made their commitment to the perilous missions less complicated by immediate familial concerns. Secondly, the demands of the job were all-consuming. Agents had to adopt false identities, live constantly on the move, build covert networks, and be prepared for extreme danger at any moment. Maintaining any semblance of a normal family life was impossible. The training itself was rigorous and designed to push candidates to their limits, testing their physical endurance, mental resilience, and skills in silent killing, sabotage, use of explosives, and clandestine communication. Those who selected candidates for SO often looked for individuals who were self-reliant, resourceful, and capable of intense singular focus. Attachments could be perceived as a divided loyalty or a potential weak point. Thirdly, the risk of capture and death was extraordinarily high. Of the 470 SO agents sent into France, for instance, about 130 were captured and killed or died in captivity. For women, the numbers were even more grim. Of the 39 female SO agents in F section France, 13 did not survive. While the loss of any agent was a tragedy, the societal and organizational burden might be perceived as less if the agent did not leave behind a grieving spouse and orphaned children requiring support. This grim calculus was an unspoken reality of such high-stakes operations. The secrecy surrounding SO operations was total. Agents often did not know the real names of their contacts, and their own families usually had no idea about the true nature of their work, believing them to be in some other branch of the armed forces or government service. This life of deception, isolation, and constant fear required a particular kind of mental fortitude. While many married individuals did serve with distinction and bravery in various wartime roles, the specific nature of deep cover SO work, operating far from friendly support, relying on wits and courage of Leslie Soul Maymonself to individuals, their single status or lack of close dependence was one more factor that could contribute to their suitability for a role where survival depended on an unwavering, undivided commitment to the mission. The agents of the SO were a unique group, and their personal circumstances often reflected the uniquely perilous and solitary nature of their clandestine war.